Historia Brittonum and Gildas de Excidio. Naturally, we'll read some Latin and translate a bit. So sit back, enjoy the sounds as we travel back to 5th century England. Badon Hill is the legendary battle fought around 500 AD between Britons and Saxons in post-Roman Britain. It was said to have been a major victory for the Britons, by some accounts under the command of Artorius, a warlord, putting a halt to the century-long attacks on Britannia from across the North Sea and the encroachment of new Anglo-Saxon kingdoms for a brief and relatively peaceful period. The earliest references to this battle are by the 6th century British cleric Gildas, popular today as containing the first mention of King Arthur, beginning a tradition that caught the imagination of later audiences, appearing in the 9th century Historia Brittonum, attributed to a certain Nennius, in which Arthur serves as a war commander of Britain. However, as these sources are not explicit or detailed, a date, location, or even details of the battle itself, such as who led and participated, remain conjecture. Here we can see southern England from Londinium to Ventasilurum and everything important in between. Aquae Sulis, Corinium, Caleva, Venta. These were the areas where much of the Saxon fighting was taking place, and along these routes you can see the Roman roads and lindens. There were numerous hill forts. Many of these hill forts have their own local histories, claiming to be the site of the Battle of Badon Hill. We're going to look at two of the texts in Latin and translate one of them. But first, some background. Roman Britain was a prosperous and comfortable province for its inhabitants, even if it might not have been the richest plum in the empire for a Roman governor. Britons, under the tandem administration of Rome and in some cases their own local and, as it were, devolved governance, enjoyed a fairly high standard of living, with running water, sewage, public spaces, centralized coinage, direct roads, and organized standing military defenses, as well as a bustling trade in agricultural products as well as minerals, such as tin, in exchange for luxuries from the south and east. Western world had ever seen, Britain was no less a part of a far-reaching network of commerce and culture. Peter Frankopan, writing The Economic History of Europe, writes that, for the vast majority of the population in antiquity, horizons were decidedly local, with trade and interaction between people being carried out over short distances. Nevertheless, the webs of communities wove into each other to create a world that was complex, where tastes and ideas were shaped by products, artistic principles, and influences thousands of miles apart. 2 millennia ago, silks made by hand in China were being worn by the rich and powerful in Carthage and other cities in the Mediterranean, while pottery manufactured in southern France could be found in England and in the Persian Gulf. Spices and condiments grown in India were being used in the kitchens of Xinjiang as they were in those of Rome. Buildings in northern Afghanistan carried inscriptions in Greek, while horses from Central Asia were being ridden proudly thousands of miles away to the east. We can imagine the life of a gold coin 2 millennia ago, struck perhaps in a provincial mint, and used by a young soldier as part of his pay to buy goods on the northern frontier in England, and finding its way back to Rome in the coffers of an imperial official sent to collect taxes before passing into the hands of a trader heading east, and then being used to pay for produce bought from traders who had come to sell their provisions at Barigasa. There it was admired and presented to the leaders in the Hindu Kush, who marveled at its design, shape, and size, and then gave it over to be copied by an engraver, himself perhaps from Rome, perhaps from Persia, or even from India or China, or perhaps even someone local who had been taught the skills of striking. This was a world that was connected, complex, and hungry for exchange. It is easy to mold the past into a shape that we find convenient and accessible, but the ancient world was much more sophisticated and interlinked than we sometimes like to think. The later centuries were not without trouble, however, as the overextended empire contended with division and rebellion, incursions of barbarian tribes along every border, the Picts in the north, as well as economic challenges. Britain played no small part in this, having been the seat to several of the western usurpers cum emperors. In 410, things were looking grim for the wealthy landowners, city and village dwellers alike, when Honorius recalled the remains of the Roman military from the province, with the advice that they should look to their own defenses. Frankopan remarks, "These days it is voguish to talk of an age of transformation and continuities that followed the sack of Rome, rather than to describe the period as the Dark Ages. And yet, as one modern scholar argues powerfully, the impact of the rape, pillage, and anarchy that marked the 5th century as the Goths, Alans, Vandals, and Huns rampaged across Europe and North Africa is hard to exaggerate. Literacy levels plummeted, building in stone all but disappeared, a clear sign of collapse of wealth and ambition. Long-distance trade that once took pottery from factories in Tunisia as far as Ionia in Scotland collapsed. replaced by local markets dealing only with exchange of petty goods, and as measured from pollution in polar ice caps in Greenland. There was a major contraction in smelting work, with levels falling back to those of prehistoric times. Contemporaries struggled to make sense of what, to them, was the complete collapse of the world order. Although Britain was not a Mediterranean province, rich in eastern trade potential, as well as political sophistication, it nonetheless presents us with a valuable and unique picture of human history at the far reaches of an empire that absorbed into it every people and culture that it so easily conquered, giving to them a Roman identity, whilst not completely destroying their own heritage. Unlike other parts of the empire, we have precious little in the way of historical sources from this period of Britain's history, such as scanty archaeological evidence which is constantly being discovered, and little to nothing in writing. We can piece together from continental sources and archaeology what was likely to have occurred politically, militarily, and economically. But the really interesting factor is what these British peoples thought about this light that would soon be extinguished, a life they had known with ideals, literature, infrastructure, and culture that was about to be snuffed out like a candle flame, with nothing to illuminate the dark times ahead. What stories did they tell? How had they been educated? How did they view their own history? And how closely did their lives and culture identify with their concept of Rome? Did they consider themselves the truer part of the empire by that time? We know that in the years following the military and administrative withdrawal from Britannia, an equally legendary story survives of the Briton prince Vortigern, his marriage to the barbarian princess Rowena, his invitation to the Saxons to come to Britain to help defend against the incursions of the Picts to the north and west, and of Hengist and Horsa's betrayal, and Vortigern's role in it, setting the stage for the imminent need to decisively rid the island of invaders. After 410 AD, no written account gives direct evidence of the events in the British Isles. Gildas Sapiens, or Gildas the Wise, a British monk writing in the early 6th century, offers us the first insight into a world that had lost many of its points of reference. De excidio et conquestu Britanniae, of the destruction and conquest of Britain. Cut off from the continent, insular scholars retained their knowledge of the Latin language, as well as the writings of the fathers of the Christian Church. We cannot do more than guess at the immediate sequel to the letters sent by Honorius in 410. That council will have been divided is certain, since there was no central authority by whom a single policy could be imposed. There will have been some who continued to believe that help would yet come from Rome, or from Roman forces in Gaul. There will have been others to argue that the wisest plan was to follow the policy that had been pursued with good effect in different parts of the empire, the policy of setting a thief to catch a thief. They would say the right course was to bring some of the barbarians into Britain and give them land on which to settle in return for their services as fighting men. Many of the wealthy, not knowing whither they were going, would seek their own personal safety in flight beyond the sea, taking their valuable written by Gildas, is the principal embodiment of a strong tradition that the fall of Britain had been brought about by the policy, catastrophic in its outcome for British, of inviting Germanic mercenaries to settle within the country in the hope that they might restore the island the security which it enjoyed for centuries through the protection of the Roman army. The history of the Britons, Historia Brittonum, presents a supposed history of the indigenous Brittonic people, written in the 9th century and surviving in numerous manuscripts dating from the 10th century onward, commonly attributed to a certain Nennius, as some versions have a preface written in his name. It has been dubbed a possible anonymous compilation of other histories or chronicles. This text differs widely from manuscript to manuscript, and it is impossible to derive an authentic version, the later reproductions influenced by and intermingling invariably with Geoffrey of Monmouth's fantastical Historia. The manuscript of the Historia Brittonum most often referenced is the manuscript Harleian 3859H in the British Library, late 11th century, the only manuscript that contains the Historia Brittonum in its fullest form, though with no prologue, and one of only 2 manuscripts that contain chapters 57 to 66. The Harleian 3859 also contains by far the oldest versions of the Annales Cambriae and the Welsh dynastic genealogies. These Annales Cambriae, or Latin for Annals of Wales, are 10th century chronicles compiled and derived from diverse sources at St. David's in Wales, of which only a 12th century copy is extant. It records events in Wales, Ireland, Cornwall, England, and Scotland, penning what would become the matter of Britain, Arthurian legend with its own genre in the High Middle Ages, taken up by such famed poets as Chrétien de Troyes and Wolfram von Eschenbach. Let's now read about Badon Hill in Gildas de Excidio, the Siege of Mons Badonicus, chapter 26. From that time, the citizens were sometimes victorious, sometimes the enemy. This continued up to the year of the siege of Badon Hill, and of almost the last great slaughter inflicted upon the rascally crew. And this commences a fact I know, as the 44th year, with 1 month now elapsed. It is also the year of my birth. But not even at the present day are the cities of our country inhabited as formerly. Deserted and dismantled, they lie neglected until now, because, although wars with foreigners have ceased, domestic wars continue. The recollection of so hopeless a ruin of the island, and of the unlooked-for help, has been fixed in the memory of those who have survived as witnesses of both marvels, as they died away when an age had succeeded ignorant of that storm, and having experience only of the present quiet, all the controlling influences of truth and justice were so shaken and overturned that, not to speak of traces, not even the remembrance of them is to be found among the ranks named above. I make exception of a few, a very few, who, owing to the loss of the vast multitude that rushes daily to hell, are counted at so small a number. Let's have a look. Historia Brittonum. This one is a very pretty copy with some Celtic or even Art Nouveau style designs on it. But the English translation is from the 19th century, and I think we can do better. So let's look at the Latin. Here in Part 4, Chapter 56, it tells of a leader called Arthur and lists all of his successful battles against the Saxons, and Hengist and Octa, Cantorum, Glen, Tuglas, Cat Coit Calidon, Goinon, and the 12th battle, Duodecimum fuit bellum in Monte Badonis, tells of the battle at Badon Hill. Let's translate that. Duodecimum fuit bellum in Monte Badonis. In quo corruerunt in uno die non genti sexaginta viri de uno impetu autor et nemo our verb. We will leave as they fell. In uno die. In one day. Again, our ablative of time within which. Non genti. 900. Sexaginta. 960. Weary. Fell. Weary men. And that is our subject. Weary correrunt. De uno. From one. Impetu Arthur. And they've got Arthur in the nominative here for some reason. Would put him in the genitive. One charge. So this battle, this 12th battle on Badon Hill, in which fell in one day 960 men from one charge by Arthur, and Nemo, no one. Prostravit eos, nisi ipse solus, ipse referring back to Arthur himself, alone. So no one, Nemo is our subject. Prostravit, and here we get our prostrat from prostrate, to strike down. No one struck them down. Nisi, except Arthur himself alone. That's a very interesting verb to use here. We're getting quite a lot of imagery, striking down the Saxons. And I will be nice and poetic, but Arthur himself. How shall we put solus into English? Arthur himself, I think, pretty much gives us the meaning we need. Et in omnibus, and in omnibus bellis, everyone or all of, we have a genitive, wars, all of the wars. Extitit, he emerged. And our appositive as victor. And there is our Latin from Historia Brittonum. This is a very interesting text, as we have seen that the beginning relates the original settlers of Britain to Aeneas and those who fled from Troy. So not only do we have here an author and an audience familiar with classical material and perhaps even Virgil, the language itself, but also the impetus and motivation to connect these inhabitants of Britain with those who founded Rome and its great empire and culture itself. So you can see how little we have about this battle itself, upon which so imagination and legend and stories were woven to create this huge corpus of Arthurian literature and ideals and dreams throughout history. I've really enjoyed spending this time with you here in the study and doing Latin again. Be good to yourself, be kind to others, and, as always, be extraordinary.